Well, once again, this week we're going to be discussing Vietnamization of the conflict in Vietnam by Richard Nixon. And we're also going to jump off of that and talk about the quote unquote peace of this conflict. And when Nixon became the President of the United States, and certainly before during the election cycle, but as the President of the United States, he focused on this idea of peace with honor and letting the American public know and letting the international community know that he believed that the United States could salvage its image in terms of Vietnam by creating the idea that the United States would, number one, put the war back in the hands of the South Vietnamese. Number two, that this would create an honorable situation for the United States of America because it was saying this is what we came here for, right? This is what we wanted to do. We wanted to, it's always been the objective that we were going to hand the war back to the South Vietnamese. And three, that somehow this would create peace in the region, that the United States would be removing itself, so by magic, voila, here we have peace in Vietnam. And clearly that's not what is going to happen. But peace with honor is the idea and the rhetorical idea that Nixon floats throughout the election cycle and certainly after he becomes the President of the United States. The person who is on board with this in terms of peace with honor is Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger obviously being a major foreign policy player, right? And somebody we still think of in terms of foreign policy. That Nixon and Kissinger together really thought that, number one, they could continue to stave off communism throughout the world, international communism throughout the world, and that they could do so by creating a sort of faux climate within the international community, that it would be one of détente. It would be this peaceful situation where, whether it was China or the USSR, that Nixon and Kissinger could create this idea of, well, we'll stay at parity here, but we will be able to create a relationship in which these international players that have been at their throats, been at each other's throats for a while now, right? That they could create some sort of leveling off of that. And so that is the main idea that they float to the American public and to the international community as what they want to do in terms of international relations. And that they were going to use this idea to also create this peace with honor, rather. Sorry, that was a slip of the tongue. Peace with honor, right? So they were going to be able to create this and create this situation between these major leaders and major nation states throughout the world, that everything would again level off, right? But Kissinger and Nixon were they had a lot of other things up their sleeves. And I know that you will see this in terms of the documentary, in terms of what the Nixon administration did in Laos and Cambodia, and other places in the world. Latin America would be included in this too. They had a very secretive foreign policy, and in many ways it was quite merciless. And this is what you're going to end up seeing in the final week of the course when you're looking at the legacy of the war in terms of the documentary, that you're going to see that this idea of the two of them being merciless is something that the South Vietnamese pick up on and really apply to this duo, this foreign policy duo. And they're the South Vietnamese, those that were on the side of the United States, those that were interested in maintaining the United States presence in South Vietnam. They're going to feel betrayed by the United States, and obviously they're going to feel betrayed by the Nixon administration. And so they see the Nixon administration as being quite merciless and see Henry Kissinger as being quite merciless. And so this, you know, this again, this isn't necessarily an opinion about the two of these men. This really, if you analyze the foreign policy, they had very particular objectives, and they didn't let anyone or anything get in their way about it. And in many ways, they were able to create some decent changes in the international climate, particularly with China. But their foreign policy did hurt many people, and the South Vietnamese would be included in this. And the Vietnamization of the war and the eventual pullout, the withdrawal of the United States, and this idea of peace with honor is going to illustrate to the South Vietnamese that this particular administration had a very specific agenda in terms of Southeast Asia, and it was to get out and basically to in the eyes of the South Vietnamese, to cut and run. And so for Nixon and really the entire administration, the suggestion was made that to the American public and to the world that the Vietnam War had been highly successful. And in a way, it had been, if you were looking at it in terms of international communism and the containment of international communism. Because even though the North Vietnamese could be considered as having established a satellite in North Vietnam for the USSR and even for China, they really didn't have these two other international powers really didn't have a great deal of power in the region, and they didn't necessarily care too much about the region either. So they gave to the North Vietnamese, whether that would be monetarily or in terms of strategy or in terms of, like we had talked about with China and actually sending troops, and the USSR sending equipment, right? That this was something that certainly helped the North Vietnamese, but it wasn't anything that made them this major satellite. The Chinese and the Soviets, they just didn't have much of an interest other than to sort of be a thorn in the side of the United States, right? So in a way, they were right, the Nixon administration, that there was this containment of international communism, and that the communism that would eventually spread in Vietnam after the United States leaves would really be a homegrown kind of communism, that it had the, smatterings here and there of Soviet style communism, but it really was something that had evolved for the North Vietnamese and sort of had become their own style of communism. So in a way, the Nixon administration really was right that if that end point really was to contain international communism, the United States had done so, right? Regardless of which administration, the United States had done so. Well, Nixon and Kissinger also really had this idea that they wanted to salvage the United States in terms of its greater image, but also in terms of the image of the United States military. And so that's one of the major reasons why they floated this idea of peace with honor, because they wanted to make sure that the United States could leave the region, sort of rhetorically explain to the world why they were leaving, and to illustrate to the world that it was an honorable thing they were doing, that they had staved off international communism, that they had given the war and given the South back to the South Vietnamese, that they were extracting themselves from the situation, and here's where we get this honor. And in doing so, and in saying that the United States had met the objectives, that it would turn around the image that the United States had created for itself and its military throughout this conflict. That it really was, and you'll see this in the documentaries, particularly about the home front, is that the war had really damaged the military's image in the United States, but it also damaged the military and the United States government and the United States as a whole, those images in the minds of particularly Western allies. And so there was in the minds of those within the Nixon administration who believed in this idea of peace with honor and floating this to the American public and to the world, that they would be able to deflect any sort of criticism of why the United States had left, and really had their fingers crossed that in leaving South Vietnam that they could paint it as a significant victory, and that they could then once again salvage what the United States was thought of. Because as we see from the end of World War II to the Vietnam conflict and through the Vietnam conflict, you see this general understanding of the United States as this. It doesn't lose its image as this new powerful leader. It's not going to change the bipolarity of the international community, but what it's going to do is it's going to put a dent in how people view the United States, sort of denting the armor of the United States and making it look bad and making the military look bad. And this was something that, here is in these few short decades from World War II, that it had changed already how people had viewed the American military. And it's going to stay like that, unfortunately, for a while. But the Nixon administration is hoping against hope that they can salvage the image of the military and also of the United States. Well, it becomes understood quite quickly within the Nixon administration that a peace without honor idea would not work unless the United States actually worked on peace along with the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. And like I said before, the initial idea was that the United States would withdraw, would pull out of the region, and that would help attain this peace, right? And the peace could be worked out between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. Well, it becomes evident very quickly that this is not something that the United States can do. It's going to have to be there. It's going to have to stay there, or the North Vietnamese are going to be able to take over South Vietnam. And so the suggestion that is made among the foreign policy members of the Nixon administration, that they can't just up and leave. They can slowly withdraw, but they cannot fully and quickly withdraw. And so it's going to take a very long period of time to leave the region. But while they're trying to leave the region, they're going to have to continue to do two things. And one is that continue to shore up South Vietnam so that North Vietnam cannot take over South Vietnam, and they're going to have to work on the idea of peace. They're going to have to sit down at the diplomatic table and discuss the idea of peace with the North Vietnamese. So while all of this is going on in terms of the idea of peace with honor, the American military is just kind of sitting there, right? They're not consulted in terms of the idea of peace with honor. So the military is doing its thing in terms of supporting South Vietnam, in terms of fighting the North Vietnamese, while all of this is going on around them. All of this discussion of the United States leaving and withdrawing from Southeast Asia on a whole. And the military is, it's beating its brains out on a daily basis, trying to meet the goals of Washington, meet the goal of staving off international communism, meet the goal of preserving South Vietnam, right? And they're doing this obviously on a daily basis, and people are dying on a daily basis. And in Washington, the discussion is, we'll just leave. And the military is livid, right? You didn't have to be on the ground there to be livid about the idea of peace with honor, that rhetorical understanding of how the United States was going to get itself out of the quagmire, right? So for the American military, initially their concern is with just Vietnamization itself, right? Their largest concern is that they know that the army of South Vietnam is not it's not ready, and it may never be ready, particularly since the United States has been working on it for a very, very long time. They also suggest that the conflict has gotten so out of hand that the United States would have to stay there and could not turn day-to-day operations over to the South Vietnamese because of the fact that almost the militaries of the understanding that almost immediately after the war is handed back, the war will be over and the North Vietnamese will have won. And, you know, spoiler alert, but that clearly is what occurs, right? So for the American military, which is the entity that sees its image deflated the most, is consulted the least about the idea of leaving Vietnam. So they're kind of forced into the idea of slow withdrawal. They're forced into the idea of shifting to protecting South Vietnam instead of being on the offensive in terms of North Vietnam. And they are forced into the idea of trying to pacify the South's rebels rather than trying to rout them out as they had been doing. And they continue the training, they continue attacking supply lines for the North Vietnamese, but there's a shift here, right? Even without the idea of the withdrawal of troops, there's a shift in terms of how Nixon views what the United States military should be doing there. And so, again, you have the switch to protecting the Republic of South Vietnam, trying to just pacify the rebels, and the military really sort of having to turn its back on the idea of being on the offensive and pushing back against and further in terms of how they are fighting the North Vietnamese. And so this is something that I suggest that you really think a great deal about as we're walking through these last 2 weeks of the course, is how the American military is viewed by the American public. Forget about the world, right? The American public. Think about how the military obviously is the entity that has been working so diligently in South Vietnam, and again in terms of offensive warfare with the North. And think about how, you know, they've put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this. They're the entity that has lost the most in terms of image, and yet there's no consultation in terms of, and they're just not even listened to when they do fight or argue about Vietnamization or peace with honor. They're just not listened to. And so think about that in terms of how for years to come, and I would say that the first inkling of a turning point for the American military's image would be the first Gulf War, 1990 being the initial conflict, and then 1991 being the full-fledged, very quick, bam, bam, bam war, right? That this is the first time that we see a change after 1975, that we see a change in how the world and the United States views the American military, that it goes on a significant downturn in terms of how people view its capabilities, and in terms of the American military, there's a long evolution of building it to the stature that it had in 1945 after the end of World War II. And then seeing in 25 years, as you move to 1965, the introduction of ground troops in Vietnam, that you only have 2 decades where the American military is thought of as like the top of the heap, right? And has this fantastic image about itself. And it's an image that it has been created for itself for generations. And 1965 to 1970, things get bad. And 1970 to 1975, things get a lot worse. And 1975 to, let's use the endpoint of 1990, it is terrible for the American military in terms of how it is viewed. So to recognize all they've given in terms of the war itself, and then recognizing how it is treated post-war, post-conflict, that it really is the entity and the group of individuals that are beat up the most in terms of the Vietnam War. So for all of the talk of peace and all of the talk of withdrawal of the United States from the Vietnam conflict, what actually happens in 1971, 1972 is actually an escalation of the war. And one of the reasons why the war escalates is because, and it's twofold really, and these reasons are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. But the North Vietnamese are trying to take advantage of the withdrawal of U.S. troops, and particularly a significant withdrawal in 1971. But on the other end of the spectrum, the North Vietnamese are really concerned about the relationship that's taking shape between the United States and China. And they know that they're going to be left out in the cold if this relationship thaws and the United States and China become buddy-buddy, because necessarily, as seeing themselves as a satellite of China, they know that any of the support that they've gotten from China is going to leave them, and they may even receive pressure from China to end the conflict, right? So North Vietnam is worried about this idea of détente that the Nixon administration is working on. But again, they're also thinking, well, we can take advantage of the idea that the United States has less and less involvement militarily in South Vietnam. And they know the weaknesses, obviously, of the South Vietnamese army, just like the United States military knows, and just like the Nixon administration knows of the significant weakness, right? So, they're taking advantage of this particular aspect of the United States operations at this time, but they're also, again, really concerned about diplomatic issues. And so they invade the South. And because of their invasion of the South in 1972, Nixon orders massive bombings in the North in Operation Linebacker. And in ordering those massive bombing strikes, we clearly see that, the North Vietnamese have escalated the war. The United States is now escalating the war. And look where we are again, right? We had talked about withdrawal. We had talked about peace. We had talked about peace with honor. And here we are back to the same things that we had been doing on both sides, right? Invasion, pushing in toward and through the South, and the United States pushing back against that, and massive bombings of the North. And so you're right there. You're at the stalemate again, right? You're right there where the two are pushing against each other and really getting nowhere, right? And so it really is a period of time where there's, again, going to be significant discussion on both sides about how in the world are we going to end this. Because the North Vietnamese, even though they're keeping the faith, the North Vietnamese, even with the withdrawal of U.S. troops, they're getting really, at the least they're getting antsy about just wanting to get it over. And at the most, they're like, with all the things that are happening internationally and with how long we've been doing this, are we really ever going to be able to take over the South? Are we ever going to be able to create this Republic of Vietnam that we had hoped for? And so here we are in this, you do this and I'll push against you, and you do that and I'll push against you, and back and forth and back and forth. And we just reached this point where even though the North Vietnamese are, still moving, and even though the United States wants to leave but is, slowly doing so, you just see that both sides are just sort of at their wits' end about what it is to do. And this escalation, I think, really proves it, that here the North Vietnamese are trying once again to get the South. Here the United States is once again protecting the South and pushing against the North Vietnamese coming into the South. And it just is like a replay of the same thing over and over and over again. And you'll see, how this really ends. But at this in the early 1970s, in 1971, 1972, 1973, before we have the significant peace talks, you see that it's just escalation, right? Even though the United States was working against that, and the North Vietnamese were really happy about that. Once again, you have these two forces, not North Vietnam versus South Vietnam, but North Vietnam versus the United States. You have these two forces that are pushing against each other, and it's just literally going to stay the same. So 1972 is a turning point in the conflict. And the reason for that is because of the stalemate and the idea that, here like I said, here we are again, right? Here we are, North pushing against the United States pushing against the North, and so on and so on and so on. And so for the United States, it's how are we eventually going to get out of this? And again, how are we going to save face? And for the North Vietnamese, it's how much longer can we keep going? Like, we can pretend all we want that we have this infinite strength, right? But we don't. We're not going to be able to keep this up much longer. And here we are. We got ourselves into the South, but the United States isn't really letting us push any further, and the United States isn't letting us meet our objectives in the South, and here we are stuck again. So both sides feel really stuck, and the United States particularly feels like, can't we just get this over with? And by the United States, I would suggest I'm saying the Nixon administration. There's a lot of people in the United States that want the war over, but for varying reasons, right? So the stalemate really pushes the United States and the North Vietnamese toward peace talks. And it's really important for both sides to try and get and retain the upper hand here. And the peace talks themselves are going to be just this back and forth between the North and the United States, and the North and the United States. And it really looks, to many, at the outset of the peace talks, that never the twain shall meet, right? And it really is, here you have, okay, stalemate pushes to ceasefire, but ceasefire doesn't necessarily, and obviously we know this in terms of warfare, but ceasefire doesn't necessarily mean a walk toward peace, right? And the peace talks are going to start, but the peace talks again are going to become something that mirrors the relationship that the United States and the North have in the conflict. And the discussions themselves are going to be so tension riddled that it really is, again, one of these events where people sort of look around and go, how how in the world is the peace going to be any different than the conflict, right? In terms of this relationship that the United States and North Vietnam have with each other, how is anything really going to be any different when they sit down to the diplomatic table? So the peace of the Vietnam conflict is achieved on January 27th, 1973. And in creating the peace of this conflict, the only real issue that is hammered out and will stay hammered out is the United States involvement in the conflict, because the peace will stop the conflict and the warfare between the North and the South, but only for a short time. But the United States role in this peace will continue to move toward the United States completely removing itself from the region. So initially the United States not being a part of any more warfare, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese not being a part of any more warfare. The United States within the treaty has the right to resume operations within the war if the ceasefire is broken between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. But for all intents and purposes, the peace is very, very shaky, because there's nothing that really is hammered out in terms of the relationship between the North and the South. And so that's where the Paris Peace Accords, even though Kissinger and the North Vietnamese representative both received the Nobel Peace Prize for the Accords really don't create peace in the region. It really, the Paris Peace Accords really only allow for the United States to get itself out of there, right? And so even though there are very high hopes for the continued effort to make sure there wasn't warfare between North and South, that everyone was hopeful for that, but there really was nothing that was done to make sure that it wouldn't start again in terms of changing the relationship and the friction between the North and the South, right? None of that was changed. So how would the peace actually last, right? So again, the only thing that these Paris Peace Accords really do is set the stage for the United States to leave. And the United States is, it's already been getting ready for that in terms of withdrawal of troops. But again, we had seen, back and forth, the United States having to sort of reinsert itself into the things that were going on and into the conflict, even though it was trying desperately to get away. These accords is what solidifies the United States' ability to get away. And so, we all know what will eventually happen. And I think that for some of you who don't know much about the war, especially as you go through the documentaries next week, you'll see what a terrible situation had been created between the North and the South, that once the North is able to re-infiltrate the South and take over the South of Vietnam and create Vietnam once again as a whole, that you'll really see that not only were these peace accords sort of dead on arrival without the hammering out of an understanding between the North and the South, but that what ends up happening, it becomes a complete tragedy, because the North is able to get what it had originally wanted, which was the creation of a whole Vietnam once again. But it was not made in the image of the United States. It was not a democracy. All of the plans that the North Vietnamese had when they first started out, when they were first talking about self-determination, when they were first talking about creating the Republic of Vietnam, none of those things are there anymore. So once the North Vietnamese are able to take over the South, it's a completely different, it's a completely different level of objectives that the North Vietnamese have for the totality of Vietnam. And so it is not going to be this strong republic that is democratic and has hints of socialism and communism. It becomes a Vietnam that is violent and is still ideologically a North and a South Vietnam. And it's really very, very tragic. And again, the real success of these talks and the creation of the Paris Peace Accords is that the United States can just leave, right? And so that's really the only success that we see, because quite quickly after, peace takes time, right? And when there are peace talks and peace accords that are reached, you take your time maintaining peace, and you take your time fulfilling all of the obligations and requirements of the peace, right? And so we don't see the full collapse of the South until 1975. So it takes 2 years for that to happen. But quite honestly, and I don't really see this as hindsight. I've looked at this over and over and over again, trying to see if it's just my, 21st century vision projecting back on this period. And you really can see by the peace itself that it's just not, it's not solid in terms of the relationship between the North and the South. And because of the fact that that portion of the treaty wasn't hammered out, it's going to be a complete and utter failure. Well, we'll be picking up on the failures of the Paris Peace Accords again next week, when we discuss really the end of the conflict and the collapse of South Vietnam. And that's really going to be how we wrap things up in terms of discussing, how South Vietnam is left, and sort of left behind and enveloped in a very haphazard way into the government established by the North. And we're also going to talk about the effects of the war itself on the United States military, but also United States politics, and U.S. society and culture. And so here's a great place to start discussing the conflicts of the 1960s, which will play into the Vietnam conflict, and the Vietnam conflict will play into this chaos as well. And then all of this sort of wraps up into, what the long-term effects are in terms of the latter portion of the 70s and into the 1980s and the 1990s, not just for the American military, which I'll talk a lot more about next week, but also in terms of African American rights, women's rights, the American government, who is in control of the United States government, how the United States military is run. I mean, the conflicts that we see in the 1960s are going to continue to inform decision making much later on, and I would suggest to the early portion of the 1990s. And so these scenes that I have here in terms of the collage that I create. They really illustrate the broad spectrum of issues that the United States goes through the major periods of the war, 1965 to about 1970. Civil rights movement, the desire of many whites to stop the civil rights movement, war protesters who came out of the political protest movements of the 1960s. You have the hippie movement represented here. You have the political violence of the 1960s represented here. Picture of Martin Luther King, obviously picture of John F. Kennedy. This period was the most chaotic period in the United States of America since the Civil War. And so there are many historians that actually view, and we'll talk about this in another slide, many historians that view the 1960s in the United States as a second Civil War. And there are a lot of issues within the second Civil War that occur because of the fact that the Civil War itself was not, the peace of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period of the Civil War were not handled in the way that they initially were going to be handled. And so many of the issues that we saw in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, particularly African American rights, that the fact that those rights were not, that they were not perpetuated, that they were not allowed to be freely used by African Americans. You see this come up again in the chaos of the 1960s. And so it's really interesting for those of you who study U.S. history exclusively. I think this is something to really focus on in terms of the chaos of this period and how that chaos symbolically can be seen in the chaos of the Vietnam War and in the decision making of the Vietnam War on the side of the United States, right? So here's where we kind of flip and move away from thinking about three different perspectives, right? The United States, the South Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese, and the Southern rebels that sympathize with the North. We move away from multiple perspectives there and move toward looking solely at the United States right now and looking at the multiple perspectives within the United States that led to this chaos and led to the massive amounts of change that we'll see in the 1960s, but also all of this is once again sort of in danger, much like in the Reconstruction period, of being for nothing because of the election of Richard Nixon in 1968 and the turn away from pushing equality and African American, Chicano, women's rights, gay rights, all of that. There's a very abrupt end to a lot of that discussion, at least in the mainstream, by 1968. So just recognize that at the same time that this war is going on, and at the same time that the United States is embroiled in the conflict, 65 to 70, I would say, I guess I would say 65 to 68 particularly I would focus on, not just in terms of what's going on in Vietnam, but in terms of the United States, and look at how chaotic both situations are in relation to the United States and how they feed off of each other. And so that's basically my point here, is that they really do feed unfortunately very well off of each other. So rather than focus on the chaotic nature of the sociocultural climate in the United States throughout the 1960s into the early 1970s, rather than just really talk that to death, because I think the documentary does a great job of showing that and illustrating that, and certainly visually, it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite sections and segments of the documentary. But instead of really focusing on that chaos, let's look at an issue of the war that mirrors what's going on in society. So in terms of society, you have people who are the protesters, the hippies, the yippies, the people who are challenging society, challenging politics, challenging the establishment, right? And then you have the people who are the traditionalists, and they're going to be the people who are against significant changes in the makeup of society. They're going to be against significant changes in rights. They're going to be against the constant questioning of the political establishment particularly, and they're going to be the people who are for, they're very traditionalist, and they're for respect of government, maintaining sort of the way the United States society was working at the time, and really supporting the Vietnam War. And so let's look at how there are two different groups of people in terms of support and non-support of the war that really mirrors this idea of anti-establishment versus establishment, and that would be the Hawks versus the Doves. And so the Hawks are not just Republicans in terms of the war. The Hawks are also conservative Democrats. And these are people who are significantly concerned about international communism. They are militaristic in nature. They see national defense, national security as being the most important thing that the United States can be focused on, that and economics. They, in this period of time, do not see the need for racial diversity, and they do not see the need for creation of quote-unquote special rights for minorities. Okay, the Hawks are also people who are extreme nationalists, and they are people who want to make sure that the United States is able to maintain its status and position in the international community. And so you can see again, here are the Hawks or the traditionalists in terms of the war, and they're very much like the traditionalists in society at this point in time. And these are the people who are fighting against a grouping of people, whether you're talking about the social or political climate or the conflict in Vietnam. They're going to be at odds with the more anti-establishment people. They're going to be at odds with the Doves. So let's talk about the Doves and look at their importance in terms of not just, we think typically about Doves as being pacifists, but obviously in just say an administration, a presidential administration, you're going to have Hawks and Doves, but the Doves actually do believe in war. Okay, so don't think that they're pacifists. They aren't, but they have a very, they have to borrow from a conservative Republican, but to borrow from George Herbert Walker Bush, they're kinder and gentler, right? They're a kinder and gentler type of American, and they tend to think in terms of global issues and in terms of maintaining international harmony before they think of militaristic measures, but they are not anti-war or anti-military wholly. Some of them are, but not all of them are. And so this is where we see this this butting of heads, right? You see the butting of heads with the hawks who are very concerned about what the situation in Vietnam means for the United States in terms of international communism, but also in terms of its image. They believe in the bombings of the North. They believe in extreme militarism and pushing United States militarism into Southeast Asia, and they're just very, I mean, it's their nature politically to have the national security of the United States at the core of all of their decision making. So the Doves, as I mentioned, are a grouping of people that are not singular in their way of thinking, right? They have disparate understandings of how the world works, how the United States should operate in that world, and they're not all sort of the hippie, peace at all costs, rather than getting into any sort of conflict. They're not just those people, right? The Doves are the people who are dissenters in terms of the war for a variety of reasons, and for those who were Doves who also were in, say, the Johnson and the Nixon administrations, again, it illustrates that Doves can actually be people who do sign off on or sanction military endeavors. It's just that they need to be done for very specific reasons, and we'll talk about that in terms of those people on the next slide. But the people that are typically synonymous with the idea of the Doves in terms of this war are those people who are protesters. They're part of the protest movement. They're liberal. They tend to be college students. They are anti-establishment. They're anti-war. And they have an offshoot of people who are part of the establishment, who are liberal members of Congress, again, liberal members of an administration, say the Johnson administration, who tend to be anti-war. They also are individuals who, again, have no real problem with challenging authority, okay? And so that's whether they're a part of that authority and they challenge that establishment, or outside of it. That's really what this grouping of people within the Doves do, right? They're really interested in shaking it up. They're really interested in changing the sociocultural climate of the United States, the landscape of the United States, and they're very interested in trying to prevent war at all costs. But in terms of the Vietnam War, they have very specific reasons why they are against it. It doesn't just go back to the idea that many Doves are pacifists, right? They have very specific reasoning in this very disparate group of people. They have very specific reasons for dissenting in terms of the war. Some of them just say it has nothing to do with U.S. security, and like I had mentioned before, there actually are people within the Dove camp who believe in national security for the United States. They believe in using the military for that, but this wasn't the war that they wanted. This wasn't something that they wanted to happen for the United States. Many of these individuals who are anti this war would have been pro World War II, right? So they're not anti-war. Not all of those individuals who are dissenting. They're just concerned about what it means for some of them, what it means for U.S. security, what is Southeast Asia, what does it mean to the United States? And to them, because they're not afraid of international communism, they suggest that this is, this region really has nothing to do with the United States in terms of its own national security. Now, there are others within that group of doves who are those idealists, right? They're those people who are extreme liberals. They are the bleeding heart liberals. They are against the war because they believe it's wrong. They believe that the war is wrong also because of the issue of self-determination. But they also suggest that the United States' involvement in the war is against international law. They suggest that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which ramped up the conflict for the United States, they suggest that that was against the Constitution, the actual resolution itself. They are individuals who are interested in humanitarian aspects of the war. There are also those within the Dove group that are nationalists. Again, they're the ones that are on the extreme edge, but they are nationalists who believe that the United States should only get into a war for very specific and emergency reasons, right? It shouldn't be what the United States is focused on. So you can see how very different these individuals are. So they're all, when you lump hawks together, they typically do tend to be the same people. There's not a lot of variation in them. But in the doves, there's significant variation, especially in terms of ideology. So keep that in mind, that not all of the doves are people who are like, oh, the United States doesn't even need a military. They're not those people. Okay, they're not all within that grouping of doves. They're not all anti-establishment. They're not all anti-military. They're not all anti-war. Some of them do believe in war and using the American military for those purposes. That is something the United States must do, and that it should be for honorable intentions, and they don't see that in terms of Vietnam. So again, recognize this, how disparate these people are, okay? So we're going to end here on the desires of the doves for the Vietnam conflict. And for as much as we've talked about the disparate nature of their belief systems, they all had a common goal in terms of the war, and that was ending it, right? They had different ideas for how to do that, and they had different ideas for how long it was going to take, but that was their end desire, right? All of the doves wanted the end of the war, regardless of whether they were anti-war on a whole or they were establishment liberals who actually believed in U.S. national security and the usage of the American military to maintain that national security, right? So again, the two opposite ends of the spectrum. But they all had that common goal of wanting it to be over, right? And so again, one of the things that I want you to see is the fact that you can use this historical construct of the hawks versus the doves to recognize the traditionalists versus the non-traditionalists in U.S. society at this point too, and to just see how each one feeds on the other, right? So the hawk-dove situation in terms of the war feeds on the chaos of the 1960s and the sociocultural landscape, right? And vice versa. And so there's this really is this chaotic portion of time in United States history that we hadn't seen since, again, the Reconstruction period, and we haven't not seen it since. We might be on the cusp of it now, but we have not to this point historically seen it, right? So this chaos that you see domestically feeds what's going on internationally. And what's going on internationally clearly is feeding what is going on in terms of the sociocultural landscape of the United States, vice versa, back and forth, back and forth. So recognize that and see that construct there, okay? So that's it for our discussion of the home front. As like I told you, the documentary does a beautiful job with this. And this is also something that I think a lot of you already know. So if you look at it in terms of the war, I think that's where you'll get the greater understanding of sort of taking what you already know and then funneling it into what you're learning about the war. So that's it in terms of the home front, and also in terms of the Vietnamization and a bit of the peace of the Vietnam conflict. And next week we'll take a look at the end of that peace and the implosion of South Vietnam and the effects of this very long conflict on not just Vietnam, but also on the United States, and very particularly the United States military.